and I've got my grid CSS example that I did. This one mimics my date time component to a point. This is pretty much how I did my date time component, at least the calendar portion of the date time component. Let's see here. I can see you. I can see you. In case you're wondering, I just don't always come back over here to check on who's giving messages. So I'm glad to see that you're here. Thoughts on Tailwind? There's a lot of fights back and forth on Tailwind. I don't get involved in those fights. I don't. I'll say this much. I've been doing software development for 24 years now, and almost the entirety of that time was spent in the web development world. I mean, I've been doing web since before it was really even something popular to do. Back in the days when we still had the CGI bin. If anyone remembers those days, I'm willing to bet there might be at least one person who remembers the CGI bin. Anyways, so I've been in a lot of different situations, and long before there were things like SCSS and SAS and all of those different preprocessors and all of those things, and before things like Bootstrap. That's another one I was trying to come up with. Before Bootstrap and Tailwind and all of them, I did a lot of projects where you had to manage a lot of you had to manage a lot of CSS files. And even when you're using Bootstrap, even when you're, well, maybe not so much in Bootstrap, but even when you're using certain things, less, there's a good one. Less is another one. And so even when you're doing all of those things, you have to manage a lot of files. And especially if you're going to get into a point where you're going to have themes. As soon as you bring themes into the list, you've just made things 10 times more complicated for yourself. You really have. And so that just brings the complexity level up even more, and how much you have to manage more. And the problem I've always had with doing things like straight CSS, especially in bigger projects, is you forget what classes you have that do certain things. And so what you end up doing is you end up rewriting a lot of classes because you've got such a large library of all these classes. And I've seen so many different things tried. I've seen people try things like BEM. I can't remember what BEM stands for. I was in one project where we did it and I hated it. And I've heard a lot of people who hate it too. So thank goodness I wasn't the only one who hated it. There's just so many things you try to do to help manage things, and it seems like a lot of times you end up with a lot of duplication of CSS. And that's never a good thing, to have a bunch of things written about the same stuff, or you have to have these little itty bitty one-offs that, oh, well, this is slightly different. This is slightly different. So I've got to write a new one because I need it to do this instead of this. With Tailwind, what happens is Tailwind is basically CSS. Each style you're writing is basically, there you go, block element modifier. Thank you. That's what BEM stands for. So here we go. That's BEM, by the way, for anyone. Yes. Thanks a lot, Shri. So basically, yes, Tailwind is basically each style you apply usually is a one-for-one mapping to an actual CSS property. That's not always true. You're going to see something here that I'll show you. I actually pulled from what's it called, from Tailwind for my component, because the next example I used some of the Tailwind styles for my component and just kind of took them and applied them directly inside of here. And you'll see there are some things that do get applied, but it's pretty much a one-for-one mapping. So what you can do is you can say, okay, well, I need to apply all of these things. And people say, well, you're just littering your code base with all of these styles and all this stuff. There are nice tools to do that. There's one I use called class name. I think it's singular class name, that allows you to group different styles together. And so therefore you don't have it all sitting inside of the class property. You have it, into this actual variable reference. If you're using something like React, or I'm sure it works just fine in Angular as well. And so you can then have certain styles turned on based upon certain properties, and it will. And what it does, what class names does, it's actually very simple. I think if I looked at the code one time, and I think it's like 20 or 30 lines. I don't think it's a lot of code, but all it really basically does is it does comparisons, like Boolean level comparisons on the properties you're passing in, and based upon what what different settings are, certain classes and certain things will appear. And so it keeps it nice and condensed, in my opinion. And then it makes using something like Tailwind very convenient, because then you don't have all of this littering, where you have these class names that are running, 3 paragraphs long or something like that, but they're all kind of contained in there. And to me, there's one thing that Adam Wathan, and I don't know if he personally put it on the site, of course, but on their site, and it's a quote from him. He said something to the effect of, if you can stop complaining about Tailwind long enough, you'll actually like it. And he's right. If you can actually just use it and just realize that it's so much easier to do than sitting there and trying to maintain all of this crap, all of these these huge files of CSS, and trying to remember, oh, this class needs to be applied in this situation, especially when you get to larger projects. Maybe people who haven't had these problems, maybe they've been in smaller projects. But in larger projects, this happens more times than I'd want to know, or than you would want to know, than I do, than I want to remember. Let's just put it that way. And so, yes, I think Tailwind is a really great library to use. I use it in all my personal projects. We use it at my full-time client, which is Myosh. We use it there in everything we do. Everything we do. When we started the project there, I was one of 2 developers that started that project, and that was one of the things we said we wanted to use Tailwind. So we did, and honestly, I haven't had a single problem that I've found from using it. And I've liked the fact that it keeps things. I know where things are. And yes, I know there's now different ways to give block definitions to styles, and you can pick your own, but I like Tailwind. I've gone way too overboard with that. But you asked me to like something, you asked me to talk about something that I actually like to do, and that's something that I like to bring up, is I do think it's worth the investment in time to learn Tailwind. And they've got a really great site, and honestly, there's a lot of really nice stuff that you can do. Speaking of Tailwind, this whole thing you see here, I took directly from Tailwind for my date time component. This is grid layout. Now, as I was researching grid layout, basically this can be used in a responsive way as well, but it just depends on how you set it up. What you see here is basically, this is defining that you are using grid layout. We have here, I'll quickly do this. Here's the way that the actual CSS or the actual HTML looks. The calendar, which is the wrapper, the header cells, and then the actual date cells. So there we go. That's our different items, and they're all in a row here. And so what we do inside of the grid layout to tell us how this should be laid out is we use grid template columns. I hate the way it continually does that. Is we use the grid template columns. And so grid template columns tells us how many columns there needs to be and what their definitions are. So how big they should be, things of that nature. This function is the repeat function. Now, the repeat function, basically here, I'll quickly show you what I could have done. So without the repeat function, what I could have done to do the same thing, let's see if it'll let me do this. Maybe it won't. Here, we might just have to do it like this. I could have done, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, if we save this, it should look the same. As we see, no change whatsoever. So that's what repeat did, basically. Repeat basically did exactly what I just did there. So that's what repeat does. Repeat basically will say, do this a certain number of times. So if you have a repeatable piece of CSS that you want to do, this isn't specific necessarily to grid template columns. It can be used anywhere where you want to repeat something, where you need multiple items within a property and you want to repeat them over and over again. It's probably used mostly in grid template columns, I'd be willing to guess. In this case, we use min max. I'm not entirely sure that the min here ever gets used. It's 0. I don't see a single cell, even this cell here, that has 0 in it. But 1FR. Now, I would always see this. I'm saying, what does 1FR mean? I actually had to look it up. I'd used this for years in my date time component and just let it just assume that, just said, okay, it must be something. What it means is 1 frame or one fraction. There's the right word, 1 fraction. So what does that mean? Well, that means here we set up 7 grid template columns, each taking 1 fraction. So what we do is the grid here, since we aren't giving it a size, takes up the entirety of the page. If you'll notice, as I scroll, it gets bigger and smaller, so the grid grows. So that's what 1 fraction does. What 1 fraction says, it takes the entire space that the grid's going to take up. We're saying that we have 7 1 fractions, so it divides each of these into 1/7 of the space that we're asking for here. So that's what FR stands for, is fraction. Now you don't have to say 1, you can say 2 if you wish. You could actually do this differently. I saw a good example when I was reading through this, where they did 3, and they did, so you could say, I wouldn't do this, but you could say 1 FR, 2 FR. You could do that with repeat, for example, if you wish to. So it doesn't have to be, I'm not sure if that would work with min max, so don't quote me on that. But if you didn't have min max in there and you just had the repeat, you could do 1 FR, 2 FR, and it would repeat both of those in succession as many times as you ask them to be repeated. So that's what repeat does. So and that's how the fraction part here works. As you see an example here, this actual, I don't know if you can read that or not, but it doesn't really help very much. It talks about track sizing and lists of names, and I had to actually dig in a little bit and do a little bit of research to find out what that meant, and so I could explain it, because that right there, the explanation that it gives is not very helpful. So basically, that's what it means. It takes up a percentage of the whole. So whatever the whole is, it takes, in this case, 1/7 of the whole. Gap, I'm not entirely sure. Gap does give a little bit of spacing. It's basically, there's some spacing between each one of these. So in this case, it probably wouldn't matter much if we did that and then we saved. See, it doesn't do that much, but as you see, the numbers went up and they got a lot shorter. So not really the very prettiest looking thing. Having the gap in there does make it look nice. So it puts space around the individual cells so that there's some spacing in there. Now, if you don't want that, you don't need the gap, but that's what that's for. Now, header cells is pretty obvious. We're bolding and centering. And then with the data cells, we're just plain centering. Now, we don't really care much about anything else here. I mean, I suppose I could have tried to do that and make it look a little bit more like an actual date time selector, where it wouldn't do it here, but it would do it here. So I could have done stuff like that. But in the end, yeah, that's pretty much how grid works, what grid is used for. Let me see here. I think I have, yeah, in a lot of my posts before this live stream today, I did show an example of my date time component. I actually do have the date time component up, but I don't really think it's worth showcasing, because it would take a little bit to actually get it running and all that kind of stuff. So I'm not too sure that would be really worth it. Let me see here.